It's exactly the same presentation with a special guest from APTA, and her name is Laura Zale. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Laura to talk to us a little bit about, all right, I'm trying to turn it over to Laura. Oh, goodness, technology is wonderful. Okay.
Good afternoon. Mish, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Hi. The technology keeps telling me that the mute is off. So thank you for including me on the agenda for the webinar. I'm really excited to talk about the work of the newly relaunched APTA State of Good Repair Standards Working Group. I think a lot of the materials that we have been chartered to develop will help to help agencies as we go forward with the implementation of TAM. You might have heard about our group before. The focus of the group has shifted a bit since we first started in 2012. Back then, we were chartered with encouraging agencies to start asset management programs with the idea of bringing your system to a state of good repair. Now, state of good repair is still a priority, and that's why we're all doing asset management. Our early work was more focused on developing a framework, helping people figure out what a state of good repair meant for their agency. But since that time, there's been a lot of change in the industry. The biggest thing is that the TAM rule was published, and Mish is going to talk about that and what that means for you in the rest of her webinar. And in that time, agencies have made a lot of progress, either collecting data, as I saw on the poll, or really implementing programs at their agencies. And then the FTA has been really busy since the TAM rule has come out, developing resources for agencies to use. I see that a list of those resources is a download for this webinar. So we at APTA are in this position where we can collate some best practices and kind of supplement those things that have been developed by the FTA. And we're in a position to work with practitioners, with the FTA, with planning partners, as well as a group of consultants to help people take their practice to the next level. So I know a lot of us, again, are really concerned with this October 1st deadline for finalizing your TAM plan, and secondary as developing your NTD deliverables, and then compliance with the triennial review. But really the focus of what the APTA group is doing is trying to develop things for you to actually make this TAM practice into a more worthwhile thing for you at your agency. That being said, we reconvened this spring, and we have 3 standards that are in active development. The first of the standards that we have going on is a paper that discusses procurement of software that will enhance your business practices. We as a group looked at the various departments and business functions that have the potential to interact with your TAM program, and we're developing a list of practices that you may have ongoing, and we look at criteria for specifying the software that can fill those process gaps. Our goal is to develop this particular paper through the spring and have it ready for fall publication. The second product that we have in the pipeline is an agency checklist for developing a TAM program and aligning it with the FTA requirements. The checklist will provide guidance at the 9 requirements of the TAM rule and for developing NTD reports. When possible, we are trying to do this at the asset category level, with vehicles, with infrastructure and facilities. Our goal for the working group is to have this document as a reference that agencies can refer to when they take their TAM plans from a policy to living at their agencies. So you can take pieces of this and kind of find ways to enhance your practice at, in different departments at your agency. We're also hoping to have this document ready by late fall. The final product that we have working on is going to take a little longer to develop, and it's a data governance document. When you look at the TAM rule, the first 4 requirements are dependent on having complete quality data about your system. After all, you can't make data driven decisions without having the quantity and condition and performance information about your assets. So this paper will focus on using a framework in the Institute of Asset Management model to develop consistent, reliable data, working at strategies, at standards, to data systems, and finally data management and how to implement that at your agency. Those are the first three things that we have working on with our group, but we do have some things that we'd like to work on in the future, including such things as developing best practices for the other 5 requirements of the Tier 1 and possibly for Tier 2s that might want to implement those as well. Some documents to help people develop the outward face of the plan. You know, where does the TAM sit in your agency? How do you use it to communicate with internal and external stakeholders? We're looking at developing some guidance for coordination between agencies and developing with planning partners. We're also looking at potentially developing some guidance for populating the asset inventory components of the National Transit Database, including the narrative report. And finally, one of the things that we would like to work on, but we're not sure that we're going to yet, is the cross-asset allocation. And how do you make decisions across an entire portfolio of asset classes? These thoughts are they're going to evolve as we continue to hear from the industry, as we all continue to incorporate TAM at your agency. So I'm looking forward to having some documents to circulate out for you all for review in the next couple of months. I'm really also looking forward to working with the FTA to see how we can develop guidance about questions as they arise in the future. Thanks, Mish.
Thank you, Laura. There were a couple of questions for you in the chat pod. Did you want to take a few minutes to respond to them now or wait until after the end of the presentation?
Why don't we wait to see what kind of gaps might get answered through your presentation, and then we can go from there.
All right, that sounds wonderful. Thanks again, Laura, for presenting on APTA's latest standard subcommittee efforts, and we will hear more from you at the end of the presentation. So today's agenda, as I mentioned before, is exactly the same as what we presented in February. There is no new content. There is just repackaged from previous content, and we're going to go through the TAM requirements, targets and relevance to planning requirements, highlights of NTD reporting, and some questions. So the TAM requirements. A lot of the things that I'm kind of pointing out in this presentation are questions that have come up in previous venues, whether they be frequently asked questions or if in other presentations folks have asked me about things like this. So the applicability is that all recipients and subrecipients of federal financial assistance under Chapter 53 that own, operate, or manage capital assets used in the provision of public transportation. So that includes all assets used in the provision of public transit, not just federally funded. So if you're using a state-funded vehicle in providing your federally funded service, that vehicle is included in your asset inventory. Only assets in revenue service are required, so if you're constructing a new rail line or a new facility, until it is in revenue service, it does not need to be included in your inventory. Non-dedicated assets such as taxis do not need to be included, although in the NTD you may be required to provide a representative vehicle for those that are providing the service. And lastly, van pools that are operated by the grantee or use assets owned by the grantee should be included. Basically, only van pools that only receive subsidies from FTA grantee could be excluded. Most are going to be included if you own any of the assets or operate that service. The rule of thumb I use is that if you report it to the NTD, you'll probably report it to the TAM. Okay, so the next slide talks a little bit about the applicability for 5310s. This used to be a super big question. It's less so now, so that actually makes me feel good that maybe I've been answering some of your questions. It really applies to open door service, so not client-based service. 5310D only, which are the alternatives to public transportation funding source, are exempt. I don't know if exempt is the right word, but you don't have to include them in your TAM plan, or their service is not applicable or subject to the TAM requirements. And coordinating services does not automatically make an operator subject to the TAM rule. It doesn't mean they may not be subject to the TAM rule. It's just that it's not an automatic trigger. So there are two types of deliverables. There are process deliverables and reporting deliverables. I'm going to start with the process deliverables. So the first process deliverable is a compliant TAM plan. And you guys have seen this slide before. It's the 9 elements of a TAM plan, all 9 for Tier 1 operators, those that operate rail or have over 101 vehicles across all fixed route or in one non-fixed route, and the top 4 for all operators. If you're interested in some of the materials we have for TAM plans, there's actually a TAM Plan tab on the Transit Asset Management webpage. The URL is at the top of this slide. Some things to point out: 5311 recipients and American Indian tribes are always Tier 2 unless they operate rail. So regardless of the size of their fleet, if they're 5311 recipient or an American Indian tribe, they're a Tier 2. Kind of something that I've learned through some of you guys, that MOUs or MOAs can help alleviate a lot of the questions regarding shared capital responsibilities. I get a lot of questions about shared facilities, shared services, who does what, how do I do this, they report this to NTD, but I do this type of service. Some sort of memorandum of agreement or understanding can help you guys identify what to expect, who's responsible for what, and how you're going to share the cost. Element 4 of the TAM plan, investment prioritization, includes all funding sources, not just federal. So I get some questions from grantees at times that say, hey, well, you know, FTA funded this piece, but we got this other funding from someplace else. For element 4, investment prioritization includes all funding that helps provide your service, And then one thing that I want to really kind of highlight is that the TAM rule allows flexibility. It is designed that way on purpose. There's no one-size-fits-all. It's a minimum requirement. You're definitely allowed to do more, and in fact, you're encouraged to do more if you have the sophistication and the knowledge base to do it. So there are some activity codes currently in TrAMS, which is FTA's primary grant-making system, that will cover development of TAM plans. You can talk with your grant manager or grant development contact at the regions to make sure that you are using the right activity line items. Different funding programs have different allowable costs, so you'll want to check with your region for the most accurate information. But most programs like 5307, 5311, and 5310 allow planning activities which might include some TAM development costs. For example, software purchases, IT expenses, amongst other. But the key takeaway here is to check with your region. So some of the other process requirements are record-keeping requirements, and The TAM rule requires you to maintain the record supporting your TAM plan. So any materials that you use to develop your TAM plan, you'll want to keep those for the duration of your TAM plan, which is 4 years. You're also required to share with state and MPOs your TAM plan, performance targets, investment strategies, and condition assessments. So the last item on the process list was certification. TAM plans are self-certified by the grantee's accountable executive, and the accountable executive is identified by the grantee. It's the person with the responsibility for approving both the TAM plan and the safety plan. Group plan sponsor does not become the group plan accountable executive, even though they have an administrative role in combining the materials for all of the participants. That doesn't alleviate the participants, the subrecipients, from approving the TAM plan, their accountable executive approving the TAM plan. This is a link to a resource, the group plan workbook, that I would recommend to anyone who is required to or considering sponsoring a group plan or who is considering participating in a group plan to take a look at them. It talks a lot about documentation, some of the considerations, pros and cons and so forth about participating and developing group plans. Currently, the certifications and assurances reflect TAM final rule requirements. So your current certs and assurances on your grants already identify compliance with the final rule. Come October 1st, part of that rule is that you have a compliant TAM plan. So basically you are already certifying that you will follow the TAM plan, TAM final rule, excuse me. So a lot of questions about oversight have come up, and the triennial and state management reviews that will start in fiscal year 2019 will have the TAM requirements in them. So next year's triennial and state management reviews will reflect questions about transit asset management. If you're interested in what that's going to look like, we have a checklist currently available on our webpage called the oversight, or I think it's called the compliance checklist. There's a little picture of it on the lower left-hand side of this slide. And even though it's in different format and terminology, the questions are pretty much verbatim what will happen or what will be in the workbook for triennial and state management. So if you could answer yes to all of those on the checklist, you should have no findings in oversight review. And then the graphic on the right-hand side is also a part of that checklist. And I really like that graphic, even though it's kind of confusing, but it kind of shows you how the information flows from one element of a TAM plan all the way through to the end. So the dark blue boxes reflect the required TAM plan elements, and the light blue boxes reflect the tier 1 TAM plan elements. So I encourage you to go take a look at that and kind of get a sense of the conceptual model for a TAM plan and how the data flows. Okay, so targets and their relevance to planning requirements. I do get a good number of questions on what is required for MPOs or what's required for estate planning, how to align and coordinate with planning. And I just want to take kind of one half step back and talk a little bit about the concept of performance management, which is much greater than just TAM, but specifically in the TAM performance management, which we have a performance management tab. The URL is up there at the top of the screen. It really reflects your targets. So target setting to FTA's performance measures. In the blue box on the left-hand side of the slide, you'll see some of the key expressions for performance management: goal, metric, performance measure, and target. And those are actually very different. In some cases, these words have been used interchangeably, but they actually mean different things. A metric is a quantifiable indicator, so it's a number. It's something that you can measure, whereas a performance measure is an expression based upon some quantifiable expression. So the highlighted red asset categories: equipment, rolling stock, infrastructure, and facilities, those are performance measures which FTA has established based upon MAP 21's mandate for grantees to set targets. You may calculate a metric, which is your raw value for any one of those performance measures, but you're going to set a target which is forecasting a future state for your performance. Now, if that went over your head, I'm sorry if that was too simplistic. I'm also sorry, but a lot of this information can be found in that group plan workbook, and I would encourage everyone to take a look at it, even if you're not planning to do a group plan, because there's a lot of information in there that I think is just super useful. So one of our performance measures, well, actually two of our performance measures, both equipment and rolling stock, use the term useful life benchmark. Now, I apologize to everyone that is so close to an existing term that FTA uses explicitly, and that is the term useful life. This is something different entirely, and so I'm going to call it ULB. The ULB is used only for target setting for TAM equipment and rolling stock targets. It is a expected life cycle or accepted period of use in service for an asset as determined by the transit provider. So that means, given your specific operating environment, what is the maximum period of use for a specific type of asset? So traditionally, FTA funding or the eligibility, can't get that out. The useful life term in grant making talks about the minimum age of an asset before FTA will participate in replacing it. A ULB is a maximum age that an agency, given their specific environment, expects to run that asset. So one is a minimum, one is a maximum, and it's completely customizable for target setting, but you can also use FTA's defaults. We have a handy cheat sheet which is available at the URL on this slide that you can take advantage of. When reporting to the NTD, the defaults will already be pre-filled, but you can change them and customize them based on your environment. All right, so what are some of the considerations? So metrics, the quantitative indicator, may change from year to year depending on size and quality of data, but that does not directly equate to shifting targets, since targets are forecasts of where you're going to be in future years. It really reflects the values and ideals and policies of an agency. So metrics may change from year to year, but targets may or may not, and that is completely a local decision. All right, a little bit more about performance management. The coordination, or excuse me, MPOs also have requirements that are from the joint FHWA and FTA planning rule. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it requires MPOs to set initial TAM targets within 180 days of receiving targets from transit providers. So the MPO target is not the same as an operator target, and we suggest that they're coordinated, but they are not required to be the same. And that kind of makes sense since an MPO may represent multiple transit operators. It doesn't really feel intuitive to require MPOs to have the exact same target as any one operator in their region. However, there may be cases where that makes sense for an MPO just to adopt transit operators' targets. But again, that's a local decision and should be done in coordination between the transit providers and the MPOs. MPOs are expected to revisit their targets that coincide with the schedule for their updates of their MPO planning products. So an MPO cycle is typically more than 1 year, so they don't have the same cycle of update of their targets that transit providers do. So again, that's another indicator that those targets may be different. And if you're interested and want more details about the performance-based planning and programming requirements, this URL will take you to a web page that has some frequently asked questions, some one-pagers, and other information, including contacts to get more details on the planning requirements. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about timeline and deliverables. I thought I had another slide in here, but I guess I don't. Okay, so as you all know and probably have done extensively, in January 2017, the first state of good repair targets were required to be set. They were not required to be reported to FTA, but that was the beginning of the annual target setting effort by transit operators. In October 2018, your first compliant TAM plan is due and will need to be updated at least every 4 years. There may be, and it's an expectation that it probably will be for many grantees, especially in the first couple of years, a more frequent update as conditions change. So if there are unexpected financial conditions or asset conditions, even something like, climate impacts or weather-related events that affect your assets, or if there are funding fluctuations that affect your investment prioritization, you may want to update your TAM plan or even redo your TAM plan in the interim of those 4 years. But the TAM plan cycle is every 4 years. Your subsequent targets or your reporting requirements are submit annually to the NTD based on your fiscal year. And as you see here, starting October 2018, the first mandatory reporting of your TAM asset inventory, condition assessments, and TAM targets begin. And it's based on your fiscal year. So 4 months after the end of your fiscal year is when the NTD report is due, and the TAM information is a part of your NTD report. 1 year after that initial mandatory reporting, you will add to those requirements your narrative report. And the narrative report is an opportunity to provide context to the data that is submitted as part of condition assessments, TAM targets, and asset inventory. You'll note the small asterisk at the bottom of your screen says that only 1/4 of the total number of facilities condition assessments are required in the first year. In the second year, a second quarter is due. In the third year, a third quarter is due. And in the fourth year, the final quarter is due. And then it begins again. So at least 25% of the total number of facilities condition assessments are due in report year 2018. So here are some highlights from the NTD reporting. I mentioned and I talked about a little bit in that timeline some of the reports that are due annually to the NTD. There's a data report and a narrative report. The data report includes the performance targets, performance status such as condition assessments and inventories. TAM and NTD are similar, but they are not the same. I like to hit this one a little hard because it's very confusing. Some requirements are actually NTD requirements, and some requirements are TAM requirements, but we kind of lump them together because NTD is the repository of all of the TAM reporting requirements. So NTD omits equipment other than service vehicle, where TAM includes non-vehicle equipment assets over $50,000. NTD is reported annually, whereas TAM is updated at least every 4 years. NTD only reports on assets in which you have full or partial replacement, capital replacement responsibility. The exception to that is for passenger stations and track. All passenger stations and all track are reported to the NTD, regardless of your capital replacement responsibility. For TAM, inventory includes all assets used in the provision of public transportation, whether or not you have direct capital responsibility. For the inventory specifically, if you don't have direct capital responsibility, you don't have to do the further TAM elements, but you do have to include it in your inventory. The NTD has a hierarchy and classifications that are standard, and the TAM hierarchy and asset classes are flexible. So these are just a few of the differences and similarities between NTD and TAM. If you are interested in getting more information about those differences, there is an NTD Crosswalk we'll be going over in a couple of slides. No. I'll answer that question later, but Gregory, right now I want to tell you it's not all assets over 50K. It's only equipment assets over 50K. All assets, period. The NTD reporting requirements, annual NTD, the projected performance targets are for the next fiscal year. So all the data in the NTD is basically looking backward over the year that just ended, except the TAM targets. The TAM targets are forward-looking. They are forecasting the performance that you expect based upon your TAM plan to be in at the end of the next fiscal year. And those are reported on the A90 form. There's also asset inventory and condition assessments, which include useful life benchmarks for rolling stock and equipment. Age is calculated automatically from the year of manufacturer. Condition assessments for facilities are A15 form, and then flow zones for infrastructure, which for NTD only includes the rail fixed guideway, are on Form A90. And if you are interested, there is a lot of information on the NTD webpage, including webinars that have been recorded and other technical assistance to walk you through what is reportable to the NTD, not least of which is the NTD manual. So for the TAM inventory, it is more inclusive than the inventory reported to the NTD. It is an inventory of all assets used to provide service, whether the provider owns it, jointly procured it, or it's owned by a third party. If it provides public transportation, it is included, except equipment with acquisition costs under $50,000. Condition assessment of inventory assets for which the provider has capital responsibility. So temporary facilities such as trailers do not require a facility condition assessment. Now I'm really going to zoom through this because this is in our TAM frequently asked questions, one of our responses. and it just goes through the TAM plan and NTD inventory. This is the crosswalk I mentioned to you guys. The first column describes what type of asset category and what type of ownership, and then it says whether or not it should be included in the TAM plan inventory, a TAM plan condition assessment, the NTD inventory or condition submittal, and then finally the state of good repair target. So you could take a look through this and kind of see where your assets fall. So it goes through all 4 asset categories. I'll go backwards really quickly. Revenue vehicles, equipment, both non-revenue vehicles, equipment over $50,000, and equipment under $50,000. Then it talks about facilities and how it is also owned, and then infrastructure, both non-rail fixed guideway and rail fixed guideway. So you can walk through pretty much any asset type that is subject to the TAM rule and figure out whether it should be in your TAM plan, your NTD inventory, if you need to set targets for it or submit condition assessments. All right, so this is a slide I stole directly from the NTD program, and it talks about the different areas and forms required for submitting to the NTD and when they're required. So you'll see down at the bottom, again, the asset inventory module URL. That is useful for you guys if you want to get some more details about the information that will be collected on the NTD A Forms. All right, so TAM group plan reporting. A state sponsor will manage TAM requirements in the same manner as current subrecipient reports. So this is also about NTD reporting. So it means if your subrecipients are currently reporting to NTD directly, they probably will continue to. However, as a group plan sponsor, you're required to submit the targets. Only new TAM reporters, which is predominantly those 5310 recipients, will be managed by the state exclusively. And there's only one A90 form to be completed for the entire group. In the NTD, there is a ability to identify who the group plan participants and who the group plan sponsor is. All right, narrative reporting requirements. I mentioned to you guys before, this is really the opportunity to provide context for those metrics, the quantitative aspects of the TAM reporting requirements. It's mandatory beginning in report year 2019. Notice I use the term report year because this also is submit to the NTD, and the NTD goes by report year versus fiscal year or calendar year. The report year represents the year the data covers. So this will be a report that covers information in your fiscal year 19. It also represents 1 year after the TAM plan is in place, so you have enough time to identify basically whether or not your metrics and your targets were a changing condition was noticed or progress towards your targets, and again provide that context. There is a example format and report online available for you to get a sense of what that might include. And then lastly, these are the TAM Phase In Schedule. This is just another way of going through that timeline we went through about 10 slides ago, but it's from an NTD-centric point of view. In the left-hand side, you'll see its report years, and then when the targets are required, when they're required to be reported, when narrative report is due, condition data on vehicles, and condition data on facilities. So this can kind of help you identify when you need to kind of start pulling this information together for a submittal to the NTD. All right, and now I'm going to go over to questions, but I do want to point out to you guys that some of the questions that I was unable to get to from the February 22nd webinar have been posted online. So those questions and answers can be accessed by going to this, this web address, or if you can't get to it right now, you can go to our TAM webpage and our outreach page. Under our webinars, there is a QA link, and you can pull down this information. All right. So with that, I am going to, ooh, I don't remember what this is. Okay. Oh, is that right? Just bear with me for a second. All right, there we go. Sorry, guys. I'm going to open it up for questions. There have been a number of questions during the webinar. I'm going to start at the top and work our way down, and whatever we don't get to, we will add to that Q&A that we have online right now. So with that, Ursula, do you have the first question?
Okay. For Laura, what IAM framework is being used to define data requirements? And that's the first question from John Wimmer.
Okay. John, the Institute of Asset Management has developed a framework for asset management. They define 39 subjects organized into 6 subject groups. And these are the areas in which they've identified that you can improve competency of asset management at your agency. The subject groups include things like planning, risk, life cycle. The APTA work is going to be looked at the plan enablers or the data components of that, and we're going to use that as our basis for developing our recommendations in that particular paper.
From Kirby, all right, from Kirby Becker, we have, how will the TAM checklist by asset category level be communicated and made available when ready?
Okay, we have a procedure by which we publish recommendations to the industry. First is the public comment period. APTA makes practices available for public comment once a month. And if you are an APTA member, or if you're an agency CFO who is an APTA member, you'll get notifications about this. Or you can look for the standards to comment on online on APTA's webpage under APTA Standards Program. There's a tab for public comment. And then after the policies are commented on and reviewed by APTA, we will be publishing them on the APTA and the FTA TAM webpage.
All right, from Gregory Collins, we have, how is the information Laura described going to be distributed? What is the method to identify recipients?
Again, I think I just covered that, where if you're an APTA member, you'll get an email blast when they're available for comment. Otherwise, when they're finalized, they'll be put on the TAM webpage.
Okay, great. From Sir McMurray, a Tier 2 provider is based out of an office space inside a county-owned building. Other county entities are also utilize space in the same building. The transit system has no financial responsibilities for the building or any of the office space. I'm not sure if that was a question, Sir McMurray.
So I'm going to also, I see the rest of the question further down, but I'm going to direct you to our frequently asked questions because this situation actually is in our frequently asked questions. John Wimmer noted that the AC Transit has been added to the peer library. That is correct.
All right, so from Greg, Ringgold, we are a Tier 2 by the definition of less than 100 revenue vehicles, but are also a direct recipient of federal funds. Does that make us Tier 1?
I don't know why that you would think that'd make you a Tier 1. The type of service, or excuse me, the assets that you have and the type of service you provide are how you determine your tier. So if you provide rail, you'd be a Tier 1. If you have over 101 vehicles in one fixed or one demand response route and or all fixed routes, you'd be a Tier 1. The type of money you receive does not necessarily affect it doesn't affect your tier at all. I think what you're asking is about group plans. And so Tier 2s are the only eligible participants in a group plan. However, if you're a direct recipient of 5307 funds from FTA, you're not an automatically included participant in a group plan. So you'd have to work with your potential group plan sponsor to have a mutual agreement that they would that you could participate in their group plan.
All right, from John Wimmer, we have, is there a procedure developed yet for a triannual or state management review?
So the procedure is the same as the regular procedure for triennial and state management reviews, where they do, I think, a scoping meeting, a pre, oh gosh, what do they call it? The GIF, the grantee information letter, or the GIR, right? Okay, they call it something else now. I don't remember all of the acronyms from TSO, but it's the same procedure that they use for any other oversight review area.
All right, from Martin Miniger, NTD had vehicle types. Is this the level we should group vehicles for targets? For example, cut-away bus versus over the road bus would be 3 separate targets? Question mark.
So, yes, I would suggest that, but you could even break it down further into fleets, because NTD allows you to put in your useful life benchmark by fleet. So if you wanted to target by fleet, you could do that. I mean, that's getting pretty detailed, but I mean, it's totally up to you. I would recommend that you do use the vehicle types from NTD for setting targets, since that's where you'll be reporting them.
All right, again from Kirby Becker, we have a 5311 defined transit system with 100 plus revenue vehicles. Does the 100 plus revenue vehicles make the system a Tier 2 for TAM?
So Kirby, I think I answered this question in one of my slides where it said 5310s are always a Tier 2, regardless of the size of your system, unless you operate rail. If you operate rail, you're Tier 1 regardless.
All right, from Sir McMurray, the FTA ULB cheat sheet states default ULBs cannot be changed unless approved by the FTA. What is the process for requesting a different ULB for an asset type?
You put it into the NTD form where the ULB shows up, the default ULB shows up. You put in your customized ULB. If the report is accepted, then it has been approved by FTA. If your NTD, oh gosh, what do they call it? It's not liaison, but your NTD contact person, I'm sorry, I don't know the terminology. They may contact you if your customized ULB is outside of normal range, just to make sure that it's not a typo. If it is not a typo and it is still outside of a normal range, they may ask you for justification for that customized useful life benchmark.
All right, from Greg Ringgold, I'm not sure if this is a question or comment. NTD does not provide for unique vehicles such as trolleys, queue line downtown connector service, medium duty vehicles.
I believe the NTD provides for every vehicle type. It may be just under other, but I am not the NTD program manager, and I would recommend you take a look at the NTD manual. I don't think there's any service type that the NTD doesn't include because you need to report on your service in order for it to count towards the appropriation. So I don't think that any grantees are going to allow the NTD not to collect their service. But I recommend you take a look at the NTD manual, and if you still have questions, contact your NTD person at your office and see if they can direct you. If that doesn't work, then you might contact your NTD liaison. If that doesn't work, then you can contact the NTD program manager.
All right, from Michael Rosum. If the agency is the MPO and the transit provider, can the targets be the same?
So if your agency, you are the transit, oh gosh, I just lost the webinar. Sorry, guys. But if your agency is the transit provider for the region and you are the MPO also, you can have the same targets. There's nothing that says you can't have the same targets, you're just not required to.
All right.
So it's about 2:57. Once I get back online here, which it looks like I'm getting there, actually I'm going to go ahead, Ursula, and suggest that we close the questions now so that I can open up our final poll questions. And folks, if I didn't get to your question during the webinar, I apologize, but we will be posting answers. Did you find this refresher useful? Why is that in there? Okay. And if yes, would you like to see this offered again? Please fill out those questions, and if you found this refresher useful, but there are things that were missing, or you have other resources that you want us to provide, please fill that out in the poll there under Did you find this refresher useful? And we'll be sure to include that as well in the notes and the question and answer for this. All right, so with that, I am going to once again thank Laura Zale for participating and representing APTA in our webinar today. We hope to continue to coordinate with APTA and other transit organizations in providing resources for the industry and for implementation of asset management. Feel free to continue to write in the chat pod, but I am going to close out this webinar and thank you all again for your participation, and have a great afternoon. Thank you.